Greetings, humans. Welcome to Psych 1, Chapter 1, uh, Definitions and History of Psychology. Let's see how far we can get into this. Hopefully we can do it in one lecture. If I get tired, we'll break it into two. Let's start with this idea. Like the very first page of Chapter 1 is an exercise in ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is where you value your own culture above that of others and just sort of forget other people exist. Chapter 1 in more or less every Psych 1 textbook is going to have this exercise in ethnocentrism. There's always going to be some story about Greek mythology and where the word psychology comes from. There's no reason really to value Greek mythology over any other kind of mythology, just history. Okay, so Euroculture, we experienced a period of time called the medieval period or the Dark Ages period. What's going on is that a succession of plagues, three major plagues, have rolled through Western Europe and Britain, and each time eliminated about a third of the population. So people are desperate. The population's really young. You know, Romeo and Juliet. Juliet was 14. Italy is chaos. And Machiavelli's writing about how to make Machiavellian decisions because Italy has been fractured into a bunch of sub-kingdoms because the people in charge are like 17 years old. Okay. After the Dark Ages, though, we get the Renaissance, the re-enlightenment of Western Europe. And what's happened is that churches have been hoarding knowledge. They're relatively stable. They can grow enough food, protect themselves, and hold on to knowledge. So knowledge, as it reemerges back into a world where people live past 20, comes out of churches. And the knowledge that they have is knowledge of the Greeks and the Romans and the natural philosophers and the people who wrote and translated Bibles. That's what they have. So if you're getting a classical education, you're getting that classical education in Church Latin and Greek, and you're studying Greco-Roman philosophy and mythology alongside the Bible, the Old Testament. So along comes Sigmund Freud, and Sigmund Freud is a Viennese boy in Austria, you know, in the 1800s. He gets a classical education. So when he's sitting around thinking about how people sit around and think about things, what are the internal processes and subconscious processes, he understands all this stuff in terms of Greek and Roman philosophy. And when he's trying to tell us about it, he's telling us about it in terms of Greek mythology, like Oedipus and Electra complexes and all that stuff. So that's kind of where that focus comes from. It comes from our initial antecedents, from being enculturated with Greco-Roman stuff as part of European culture. Which is not to say that other people in other times on the face of the planet weren't thinking about, what does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to be human? You know, are the Greeks the only people who ever had an idea about thought processes, tragedy? No, of course not. Of course not. Confucius was writing stuff down 2,500 years ago. He had some really specific ideas about filial piety and respect for your elders, but he was writing those ideas down and thinking it through. And China had civilization 1,000 years before England was even a country, and they had a system of examinations and rigorous processes for selecting out the best people to serve in government postings. Egyptians were writing stuff down 4,000 years ago, just covering the walls of temples and tombs with their speculation about the afterlife, especially, is what we like to read about. But that afterlife really reflects what they think life is like. What's the purpose of life? And there's plenty written about politics and religion and medicine. We have ancient human skulls with holes in them where other people drilled holes in their skulls. They used flint rocks to crosshatch and pull out little squares presumably to relieve cranial pressure after a head injury. And the best thing about this is those skulls show evidence of remodeling, which means that your bones repair themselves over the course of your lifetime, and we have calcium deposits showing that those holes were slowly starting to close. People survived those primitive operations, with flint knives and no anesthesia, no antibiotics. They knew what they were doing. So kind of Euro people who look like me like to say the ancients and the primitives and all that stuff. And we say Egyptians thought that your consciousness resided in your heart. And they might have said that to each other or to lower class people, but they knew when it came to it, they knew that you lived in your brain and were connected to your eyes. We have hundreds of different oral histories from different Native American communities. We have so what we would call sub-Saharan Africa. People of just because we don't have anything that they wrote down, and it doesn't seem at this point that people were writing down stuff the way that we're used to from China and temple walls and all this stuff. Doesn't mean they weren't thinking about it, or that there weren't writings we don't have access to after colonial powers sort of invaded and destroyed everything. And that's what the colonial powers did. You get into South America, people were absolutely writing their thoughts down in complicated languages. But when the Jesuits showed up, when the Spanish showed up and the Portuguese, they destroyed all of the writing they could find and would punish people for reading or writing in their own native languages. They taught them Spanish and that alphabet, and everything else was the devil's work. So here, not only ethnocentrism, but something a little bit more sinister where whole histories have been erased. I just want to stay sensitive to that. There's no reason really to start with Greeks. What does this have to do with psychology? Everything. Everything. This is the very beginning of psychology. It starts in this at least ethnocentrist, at least insular place, and sometimes more sinister than that. So what are we talking about anyway? When we say psychology, what do we mean? And like the official line on this is going to be, it's the scientific study of behavior and mental process. And next week, we'll get a little bit more into how do you scientifically study these things, okay? But for now, why? Why scientifically study these things? Well, think back to the epistemology lecture, which I hope you listened to and studied. Remember that epistemology stuff, that there's no really great way to arrive at certainty. And there are better and worse ways to arrive at certainty, but none of them get you all the way there. What we're really left with is this postmodern empiricism, right? Data is the worst way to make a decision, except for all the other ways to make decisions. And in psychology especially, what we believe is true can have consequences. For example, I've certainly assisted in injecting psychiatric patients with medication against their will, because we believed the medication was effective, that their psychiatric condition was a grave disability, and that we had the legal right to do this, and it was the right thing to do. It's a lot of belief, isn't it? It's a lot of trust to put into a set of professionals. It can result in confinement. Right? People confined to psychiatric institutions against their will. It can result in some miscarriages of justice. What happens in a court case? Maybe we have dueling psychologists or dueling psychiatrists. The defense team hires some, and the prosecutor hires some. And these expert witnesses show up and try to convince the jury that they're the real expert and their point of view should hold sway. And that can mean that some people who are guilty of crimes don't face all of the consequences, or some people who are not guilty because they're not capable of mens rea, or the guilty mind, instead face consequences. It can result in children being taken from their parents. I believe you're an inadequate parent, and I have my system for evaluating that I believe in, right? That some parents are authoritative and some are authoritarian, and you are too authoritarian, or maybe rejecting, neglecting, an inappropriate style of parenting. I believe it. I show up at your house and see what's happening and take your kids. Can result in a million racist YouTube videos. If you, for some reason, had to find a video on race and IQ in America, there'd be one or two that provide good information, and 1 or 2 million that provide misinformation. What happens when the social media companies get hold of information about how people pay attention, what causes people to pay attention? What happens when they use algorithms to make sure that you scroll endlessly through your Fakesbook feed all day, every day? What happens when they provide information in the form of pictures and memes, and it gets to the point you can't even read a written paragraph on a Facebook feed? What does that do for your life? What does it do for your education, for your ability to focus at work? Never mind politics. We'll talk partisan politics a little later in the course, but these people also have picked up the tools of psychology just laying around where everyone can get them, and use them, weaponize them against you. Is that okay with you? Why do it scientifically? Because when we do it ascientifically, we wind up with some sloppy conclusions, and those sloppy conclusions have really serious consequences for people. Behavior and mental process, does that cover everything? I think basically, more or less, any ideas you'd have could probably slot either under observable behavior or processes happening in people's minds when it comes to psychology. Psychology is about us, by us, and for us, right? So it's not like we ever had a convocation of everyone in psychology and the affected profession stakeholders like social workers, and then voted on a definition for psychology. And you are psychologists, honorary, but you're an honorary psychologist. You're a student, a studier of the human psyche, at least for the next 11 weeks, right? So because it's by us, for us, and about us, whatever you think psychology is, it probably is. Okay. I'm a humanist. I'm an existential humanist, and so I prefer not to really study dogs and cats and whales and stuff and lab rats. I don't think they're very informative about the human condition, and I'm very focused on the condition. But psychology doesn't necessarily focus on humans. Other fields might be really interested in horse psychology or something. That's absolutely valid. If that's what you're into, I mean, a little more definition here. 4 ways to be in psychology. You could be a psychiatrist. I'd argue a psychiatrist is not really a but we derive from the field of psychiatry. So that's in our antecedents. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor with some psychological training. Post-doc, you go through your whole medical process, you get your MD, and then you start to study additionally psychology. And today in the modern world, psychiatrists don't do a lot of diagnosis of mental illness, certainly treatment of mental illness in terms of talk therapy, or really they just pull out the prescription pad and write scripts for medication. Psychiatry as a whole, it's hard to see them as anything but an adjunct of psychopharmacology at this point. And we'll keep hammering that point home. Someone in the room might want to be a psychiatrist one day, and I'm talking to you. Okay? That we need psychiatrists who do more than just peddle medicine, that just buy into the idea that everything about us is medical and all of the interventions therefore should be medical. Two kinds of psychologists, right? Doctors of psychology. You can go and get your PhD, and you will thereafter be a scholar. So the PhD has a research focus. You understand research, how to construct it, how to do it. You're going to do a lot of it in order to graduate from school. And so you'll be a scholar or a scholar-practitioner. You can't practice. But the first time you meet a patient is going to be at least in your internship year. There's no practice. So this takes 5 years. You're going to go to school for 4 years, just study like crazy, all that research, epistemology basis stuff, how to do this. And then the 5th year, you're going to write a dissertation, a really research heavy, very scientifically solid dissertation, and do your internship. Okay. So if you practice, you'll be a psychologist, or if you're in therapy, you'll be a psychotherapist. Not a ton of PhD psychotherapists out there, but you can do it. You can do it. An alternative, sort of a modern alternative, is the PsyD. That's what I have. I'm a doctor of clinical psychology, PsyD. And if you do this, you're not a scholar practitioner, you're a practitioner-scholar. So I can practice psychology or, again, psychotherapy, and my practice would be grounded in the research, but I'm not really trained in very seriously constructing that research. I've been trained to be a good consumer of the literature. I understand the epistemology and how to do studies, but that's not my focus. Now, this is going to take 4 years, and it seems like 4 years is less than 5 years, but it isn't, because almost on day one, we're going to start a clinical practicum. Okay, so you do 3 years of academic study. That academic study is really not to do with sort of abstract principles of cognition, decision making, and so on. It's really focused on best practices in psychology and psychotherapy. But alongside those 3 years of classroom education, there's the clinical practicum, where again, almost on day one, you're meeting your first patient and interacting. Whatever, it could be in a medical psychology context, it could be in a clinical psychology context. Mine was in a psychotherapeutic context, psychotherapist. And then in year 4, you'll write that dissertation and do your internship. Now, the dissertation put out by a PsyD is often considerably lighter than the dissertation done by a PhD. We're not interested in knowledge for its own sake. We're really interested in treatment outcomes and best practices, and you'll often get those sorts of focus. What else on that? Internship year, let's say about a quarter of psychology graduates per year are PsyD versus PhD, but half of internship acceptances go to PsyDs. because those clinical sites, people don't want to be introducing you to your very first patient there. Okay. You can practice with an MA or an MS. You can license as a counselor, licensed practical counselor, LPC. You can be a school psychologist. The only person who can say they're a psychologist and not have a doctorate is a school psychologist. That can be problematic because at this level, there's a lot of this sort of abstract education taking place, and like bigger interest considering stakeholders other than the person in front of you. But the school psychologist doesn't get, and that leads to some problems we might have time to examine later, like the just rampant overdiagnosis of ADHD and autism. Autism is very, very popular right now. To be clear, those things exist to the degree that something abstract can be said to exist. There probably is an underlying phenomenon. Somebody has it. I've met people who very clearly experience ADHD, for example. I'm autistic. Yeah, but probably a simple majority of people with those diagnoses don't have the conditions. Okay, next point. So there's the 4 ways to be in psychology, and these are really the 2 psychologists. All right. Why study it? Like if we're in the classroom where I prefer to be at this point, I'll usually go, who's here because they are going to be a psychologist one day? And in a room of 20 or 24 people, half the time one person will raise their hand. Most people are here because you have to be. We're making you take psychology. You didn't wake up one morning and go, you know what I want to do? I want to take psychology classes and not have a psychological career. Fine, there's reasons where you make people take psychology. As long as that's happening, I hope you can find something of value in the course. Right? It's about us. We exist. It's about being human. And so hopefully you find something that's applicable to those future careers. Psychology is about writing. I'm not going to focus super heavily on it, but we are going to learn a little bit. And especially critical thinking. As I've been trying to hammer into you, our epistemology is especially thorny, right? We have a particularly tricky epistemology. Not everyone can wrap their head around it. And we have it because of the consequences of our beliefs in what's true and false. You know, I don't care what religion you are or if you have or don't have a religion in regular life, but the way we make decisions, right, that kind of thinking is not appropriate to our decision making as psychological professionals given all these consequences, right? I don't care if you believe the earth is flat, you watch YouTube videos on your off time. But if you take that decision making process, which is fundamentalism, you have a belief and only accept information that justifies that belief, right? You're not going to be good at psychology. You're going to hurt people. Critical thinking. We do critical thinking like nobody else because of the consequences of mistakes. And American business used to value that. We live in a particular time. Starting in maybe the early 2000s, we had the rise of activist day traders who would really punish companies for doing anything but making profit. There's a whole history there. Get it in your economics classes. And America, businesses used to be patriotic and socially minded, right? That you take care of your employees and your employees take care of you, and we have retirement plans, and we look for good people, moral people, and smart people. You could start in the mailroom and work your way up through an organization to vice president or something. Much more egalitarian. And in those days, business really valued people with undergrads in psychology. As among other liberal arts educations. Now the word liberal is poison. Liberal arts, oh my God, useless, impractical. Critical thinking now. Look, in a world where almost nobody practices in their degree field, don't you want a degree that is flexible? With a psychology degree, you get critical thinking skills and writing skills, and those skills are portable to whatever profession you're doing, aren't they? But what starts to happen by the early 2000s, companies aren't willing to spend money training people to do a job. And frankly, the jobs keep getting more and more specific and technical, where it isn't really practical to spend that money. And so instead of a broad liberal arts education that proves you can write well and think critically, they want a technical degree that shows you can do a specific job. So training got outsourced. It got outsourced to you. You pay a lot of money to buy the technical skills that you need to do work in the labor force. And education falls by the wayside. Education in America has largely been replaced with technical training. You come to school to get job qualifications. As an educator, that proposition doesn't sit well with me. But here we are. And the community college literally has a social justice mission where we're trying to connect people with work. And so I've come to terms with this fact. But along the way, we are making you take some courses that are education and not technical training. You might resent it, but we're going to do it anyway. So there's that. The value of psychology, if you don't go all the way, you need a master's degree to do anything meaningful in psychology, right? I know almost nobody's going all the way there, but we will do the critical thinking stuff heavy. All right, so that's good. Let's talk history and subfields. We always start with Freud. Sigmund Freud, Uncle Siggy. And I don't want to talk about Sigmund Freud. It's going to come up a couple more times in the term, and I'll try and contextualize him. But look, Freud was not a scientist. He was a natural philosopher. As we have to talk about that. The difference between science and natural philosophy is the theory. All right? Freud didn't have theories, really, because a theory, as we'll see in chapter 2, a theory is an explanatory framework that results in one or more testable, falsifiable hypotheses. Write that down for you. Theory, an explanatory framework resulting in one or more, let's say, testable hypotheses. Yeah, good. And most of what Freud is saying just is not in any way falsifiable in principle, and so it's not science, it's natural philosophy. Natural philosophy is where you walk around and see phenomena, you trip over something and you go, well, that's interesting. An objectivist standpoint, for sure. And you come up with some explanation for why that's happening, but then you believe the explanation and you defend the explanation, sometimes to death. So Lucretius is out there, one of the Greeks, a Greek natural philosopher 2,000 years ago, give or take, and he just wonders one day, how is it that people can see things? And he comes up with this set of conjectures about optics. Basically, he says everything's made up of tiny little versions of itself. So I'm sitting here in front of my webcam, lecturing to myself, and but I'm made of like trillions of tiny little Jasons, right? And while I'm sitting here, I'm vibrating and everything's vibrating all the time. And so some of those little trillions of copies of me break off, and they waft through the air, and they land in the camera. They land in the other person's eye, because that's what the Parisians had at the time he came up with this conjecture. And then he had this idea, and he's like, oh, revelation, writes an epic poem about it, runs across the country to the king or the emperor or whoever, and declaims it. And then once he said it, he has to believe it's true, and like, no questions. You have questions, don't you? Right? Like, let's say we're looking at a table, and the table's made of a trillion tiny copies of the table. Does that even make sense? It's stupid on its face. But let's say you karate chop the table in half. Yeah! Is the table now the halves? Are they now made up of trillions of halves of tables? What are you talking about? You take a chair leg, is it made up of trillions of little chair legs? And then when you nail it to the seat, do the little things it's stupid. It's a stupid idea. He couldn't know it was a stupid idea. In retrospect, it's the dumbest thing he's ever heard. That's Freudian analysis. Freud's just sitting around speculating about what's going on in people's minds, with never a mind to being able to test those, test any hypotheses later. He in fact doesn't have hypotheses, just these explanatory frameworks. So he's not a scientist, he's a natural philosopher, and this is a science class. He's also not a psychologist, he's a psychiatrist, which means that his allegiances are to the medical profession. All right. And we're not. We're psychologists. We don't do medicine. And Freud's stuff is more or less discredited and disproven. His ideas are weird and sexist, and arguably can lead to a lot of racism. Very, very problematic. And I just don't want to talk about it. Freud was not always wrong. Like, he had some basic ideas that are basically right, but the elaborations are really just not worth our time. So early in the history of psychology, Wilhelm Wundt and William James, 1880 to 1905 kind of time period. There's two big things happening in science. And both of them might have happened a little earlier than this time period, but the way ideas are disseminated is not instantly. This stuff is making it splash. Evolution through natural selection. Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species in 1860, give or take, right? By the 1880s, we're really considering it very hard. And by the 1890s to the 1910s, there's a lot of pushback from religious people. And yeah, so that's out there, that's happening. The idea being that we have traits because those traits are adaptive. Why do monkeys have prehensile tails? Because there's intermediary forms, and the closer and closer you get to the form, the more breeding success you have, and therefore the things with the genes, Darwin didn't know about genes, but the things with the genes from that successful and proliferate. Why do we have different colored eyes? People, I have blue eyes, very light. I'm very photosensitive. I go out in the daytime and blink and I can't take it. I get sunburned really easy. Not a lot of melanin happening here, you know what I mean? Because my ancestors came from northern climates, and we need vitamin D to live. You get it through sunlight. But there's so little sunlight in northern climates, at least pre-global warming, that if you have dark colored skin, you're not going to get the vitamin D you live. And so the people who had lighter colored skin and eyes would breed more successfully, and that trait for melanin deficiency would sort of proliferate the population. Meanwhile, if blue eyes show up on the equatorial savanna, right, you're not going to be able to breed because you can't keep your eyes open. You know, you're all squinty and nobody likes you. You know, evolution through natural selection. And then the other big thing happening out there is elements, the discovery of elements. People at one point believed like sand was the smallest thing in the universe, and you can't break sand into smaller pieces. But we get microscopy and we see that you can get smaller and smaller particles. We discover that the base, the smallest thing is the atom, and atoms form molecules, and atoms come in flavors, right? However many elements it is. So everything's made out of combinations of atoms formed into molecules, and just these few basic components make everything we can observe. Right? Yeah, and later that turns out to be horse hockey. But that's what we know at the time. Okay. Does this matter? Absolutely it matters. So we look at Wilhelm Wundt, and Wundt has his psychology lab in Leipzig or whatever, 1880s period. He's doing psychological experiments. And what he's after really is the elements of mind, right? He's into the chemistry thing, and he wants to be able to do psychology the way a chemist would do chemistry. So he's looking for what are the base components of mental process. His student Ed Titchener especially was explicitly after the elements of mind. So Wundt is a structuralist, okay? He doesn't want to know what it's for, he wants to know what is it made of. William James, on the other hand, is a functionalist. So he's not inspired by chemistry, he's inspired by biology through evolution through natural selection. So evolution proposes that every physical trait we have at some point in history had a function, and maybe it doesn't have that function. Why do men have nipples? No good reason. Why do we retain the hair on the tops of our heads but not over the rest of our bodies? It just hangs out. It's probably a spandrel, which is a trait that really doesn't offer a survival advantage, but also doesn't offer a survival disadvantage, and so it just hangs out, and there's no reason to make it go away, right? That's the stuff James likes, and he goes, so for the physical stuff, we can tell the stories about how that would be true, but what about the behavioral stuff too? Like, why would people get angry? Well, anger probably has an evolutionary reason, and happiness and love and so on. But he can also localize this. So if you have a pattern of behavior that's dysfunctional today, you probably develop that pattern of behavior because it was functional at some earlier point in your history, right? So children and tantrums. Tantruming when you're 2 might get you what you want. And so you have to learn through life a better way to get what you want. If you never do, you might be like 12 having tantrums, right? And that would be a problem because now you have a dysfunctional behavior, okay? We trace all that back to William James. Now the book here is really trying to make a point. We're going to reduce James to functionalism and Wundt to structuralism. They're actually really complicated characters with tons of ideas, and it's really unfair to like reduce them to these labels. William James in particular, if you look at the current subfields in psychology, every one of them harkens back to William James. We all call James the father of our discipline, right? So neuropsychology, James is the father of neuropsychology because he wrote some stuff once about brains and neuroanatomy and how they would impact behavior. He's also the father of existential psychology because he wrote some stuff about the fear of death, you know. It's just that when he was writing, There weren't subfields in psychology. It was all psychology, and you were free to write about everything. Okay. So it's really unfair to reduce them to those labels, but you need to do that to pass the mastery quizzes. Our open ed book has a thing on Gestalt psychology. Doesn't really belong here because Gestalt really made almost zero splash in the psychology universe. I suspect that one of the authors of the book was a Gestalt person, and so sort of slid that in. But when we're talking forces in psychology, it's going to be Freud, and then the behaviorists, and then humanists are the third force in psychology. Gestalt, there's a few people still practice it. You're allowed to like it. It just doesn't go here. Okay, so the behaviorists come along by 1911. There's a healthy practice of behaviorism. Pavlov has noticed that you can change the behaviors of dogs by repeatedly exposing them to stimuli. And then Watson starts doing this with people, notably with little Albert, who's a baby, the child of one of his research assistants, starts experimenting on Albert. And then Skinner, by the 40s, Skinner's pretty much of a big deal, changing behavior through reinforcement largely. The behaviorists are really worried about the domination of psychology by, on the one hand, Sigmund Freud and sort of the foundationalist castles he's built in the sky, these weird speculations about id and ego and superego and sex and stuff. And like, that's weird. What if we want to study stuff like a scientist, right, and base it on something? We don't want to have to go to medical school and then spend 8 years in psychoanalysis and conform to that and then practice from it. That's all really unethical. We don't want anything to do with it. We want a license as psychologists. And then the other concerns with the medical control of the profession, to even get into the clutches of the Freudian analysts, you had to go to medical school first. But what does medicine have to do with psychology? Nothing really. So these are the behaviorists are really the first campaigners to have in America psychology separated out from the medical industry. Humanism gets started. Rogers is working by the 1920s, but really by the 40s and 50s, these guys are all kind of big deals. Abraham Maslow. There's a thing here about the hierarchy of needs. We're going to do that later. I hope there aren't test questions on it in chapter 1, but if there are, just look at the thing. Carl Rogers is sort of the progenitor of humanistic modes of therapy. Virginia Satir is a family therapist who practices humanistically, and we'll have some important stuff to say about her when we're talking about punishing children, for example. And then Ora Krug was one of Rogers' contemporaries, and being a woman doesn't get a lot of credit for her super important early work. She's still alive, and you can look her up, and she's fun to talk to. So humanism is concerned about some of the things that the behaviorists worry about. So they also think that Freud is building weird sky castles with no basis in reality, and that those weird sky castles are kind of inappropriate. They're dehumanizing people. They're reducing everything to sex and sexuality and women and men. They're leaving a lot out of the human experience by doing this. But they're also worried about the sort of narrow view of behaviorists. Behaviorists want to study like scientists, and so they take the view that we can only scientifically study that which is observable and measurable. And at the time, like, you can't observe and measure emotions or thoughts or decision-making processes. hopes and aspirations, and it leaves out almost all of the human experience, right? So if you are able to take psychology too, there will be more time to talk about humanism and humanistic psychology. I, in particular, am going to spend some time on it again because I am a humanist, an existential humanistic psychologist. For now, what I want you to know is that politics is everywhere. How did Gestalt get in the book at this point in the book? Probably because politics happened. It's an open access book and didn't have to go through the usual channels and approval processes. So they wrote what they wanted, and what they wanted was to be included. Anyway, I'll try and ignore it. Okay, where are we? Oh, so politics is everywhere, and the field is skewed really heavily towards the stuff that insurance companies like. Insurance companies like things that are short-term, practical fixes, not very expensive, obviously, and that can align well with giving people medication and medical solutions. Perhaps as a result, 80% of college faculty in psychology identify with cognitive behavioral approaches to psychology. They do the studies, again, take Psych 2, and I'll show you why that's problematic. They do all the studies, they write all the papers, and if 80% of people on college campuses are of one approach, you have to include that approach heavily in the textbooks, and the people are writing the textbooks anyway, and so more or less every Psych 1 textbook is going to include some pretty silly criticisms of humanism. If we were writing textbooks correctly, what would happen is I'd get a cognitive psychologist to write the section on cognitive psychology, right? And I'd get the humanist to write the thing about humanism, and a behaviorist to write the thing about behavior. Not what happens. We're getting these outside perspectives. Let's leave it there for the time being. Cognitive psychology comes next by the 1950s. They're also worried that behaviorism leaves a bunch of stuff out. They don't like the way that humanists don't seem, in their view, to be scientific. They're still concerned about observable and measurable and taking a scientific over scientific approach. Humanism's plenty scientific. All of the initial outcome studies come from Carl Rogers. That's a nonsense criticism no one's leveling right now. So they're worried about this, but they think that you can study mental process. You have to bring to be psychology. If you're not studying mental process, you're not doing psychology. You have to bring that. But they're really creative about finding ways to understand how people make decisions and what thoughts in their head and what are their emotions. Right? So cognitive psychology comes back. By the 60s, we have some minority psychologies, Black psychology and feminist psychology primarily. Yeah, and these are liberation psychologies. Right? Black psychology is a liberation psychology in the 60s, and feminist psychology is a liberation psychology. And existentialism is arguably a liberation psychology for everybody. Okay. So feminist psychology taking place in the context of largely second wave feminism. The idea here is that the problem might not be the patient, right? The problem might be the society in which the patient finds herself. So maybe you're sitting with a client and your client is anxious and depressed. Is it your job to make her not anxious and not depressed? Maybe that's not productive. As Jiddu Krishnamurti said, what did he say? Let me find my thing. It's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. And we inarguably live in a sexist society. And 50 years ago, when feminist technology is a thing, much, much worse, right? So it might be that your client is anxious and depressed because life as a woman is dangerous and depressing, right? Women are on average smaller than men. And particularly in the 60s, not encouraged to be very physical. Those crime stats that are out there. Look, men are by far more likely to be the victims of violence than women. From other men, not from women. And certain kinds of violence seem to lean heavily towards women, and women are much more vulnerable. We have big pay disparities, 78 to 81 cents on the dollar in modernity compared to men for the same work. Work disparities, when women get careers, they still do almost all of the home and childcare activities. It's really impossible beauty standards, anxiety marketing, impossible people on magazine covers with airbrushing and then with just computers and Photoshop and stuff. It's literally impossible to look like the fashion models because even the fashion models look like the fashion models. Jennifer Lopez on her dance show with her crew of spacklers and painters and airbrushers and stuff, making sure everything's roped exactly into position and she looks perfect at 50. You can't. It's literally impossible. Being valued for your sexuality, but not too much, not too much all the time. So this is, I meant to put this in. Margaret Atwood famously quipped, when a man goes on a blind date, he's worried his date might be fat. When a woman goes on a blind date, she's worried that her date might kill her. So your client might have actually good sociological reasons for feeling the way that she feels and thinking the way that she thinks and acting the way that she acts. The solution to her problems might not be to teach her resilience or distress tolerance or coping skills or write her prescriptions for Valium, as was happening a lot in the 60s. Dude, sometimes the solution to a person's problems is to burn down the patriarchy. So the feminist psychologist would sit and listen to a woman's problems, but then explain to her that her anxiety is righteous. She's right to be anxious under the circumstances, to see all the ways that she's disadvantaged. Give her explanations for the feelings, not solutions. And then trust her to make the right decision under the circumstances. And honestly, sometimes to encourage her to stand up for herself and divorce her husband and demand a raise. And most modern psychotherapists wouldn't give a bunch of advice. I want you to enact your agenda, not my agenda. That's why I'm a humanist. Okay. Black psychology. So in the therapy line, Black liberation psychology is like feminist psychology, the same stuff. Your Black client is depressed and anxious. If you're Black in America, why wouldn't you be depressed and anxious? Right? Things have gotten better. Are they perfect? Absolutely not. We have yet another case of a young unarmed Black man being shot to death in the street and the justice system kind of looking the other way. Right? I've so many names I can't remember all. He's out jogging and he's seen on a security video at a construction site getting a drink of water, and then two white dudes roll up on him, follow him with a pickup truck, you know, menace him, and then approach him with a shotgun to make a citizen's arrest. And in America, two white guys pull up on you in a pickup truck in a southern state, and they pull out a shotgun. Of course, you're going to wrestle for the shotgun. And they shoot him and say it's self-defense. That's every day in America. Come on. And in 1968, why wouldn't you be depressed and anxious? So the Black liberation psychologist just contextualizes those feelings. It goes, that's normal under the circumstances to feel that way. Now, what are you going to do about it? There's more history here. Black psychology is not all liberation psychology. So in 68 at the APA convention, American Psychological Association convention, there's a sit-in. It's very famous, it's storied, but it's not really well recorded in a bunch of places. I've given you a source here and kind of in milquetoast sort of terms, downplaying kind of terms. It tells you something happened. What happened was the APA president gets up to give their inaugural address, kick off the keynote, kick off the con. Black psychology has taken over the middle of the room, and they are chanting slogans and standing up and disrupting proceedings. They have a petition, and they just want to get in rooms with people and deliver their petition. And they disrupt the proceedings until they're heard. And then when they're heard, business goes on and the convention happens and it's cool. But also those Black psychologists get in the rooms with the people they need to be in the rooms with. They get to sit down with the APA president and they deliver their petition in person. And the whole course of psychology starts to veer in a new direction. And that direction is towards multiculturalism, towards acceptance, towards respect for diversity. The idea here is that psychology is supposed to be about people, not about European people, or more specifically, white people. And we have to start to acknowledge this sociological context. We can't keep telling Black men that they're paranoid when they are in fact in danger. Right? We have to acknowledge the context and cultural differences and different approaches and value everyone equally. And that work got started because of this sit-in in 68 from Black psychology. Good. And then we don't have time for a bunch of names and individuals. We're really going to talk about the principles and decontextualize them from their human antecedents. But I mean, if you have time and you're interested, look up some names, man. Black psychology and Black psychologists have made really major contributions to the field of psychology. They're almost always unsung or undersung. The Clarks, Mamie and Phipps Clark. Social workers, psychology degrees, but they're largely social workers. They're working in Harlem, 50s and 60s and 70s, and really looking at the impacts of racism and a culture of racism on people of color, Black people, African Americans. Mamie Clark in particular, if you've ever heard of the doll test, where we have maybe 5-year-old Black girls and we have baby dolls, a white baby doll, an identical Black baby doll. And we ask the girls questions about the dolls. Which is the pretty doll? Which is the smart doll? Which is the good doll? Right? And they keep pointing at the white doll. Which is the bad doll? Which is the ugly doll? Which is the mean doll? And they keep pointing at the Black doll. We say, which doll are you like? Right? And they get mad or they cry or whatever, but they point to the Black doll. They know which doll they're like. By age 5, by just existing in a racist society, they've internalized all these standards and they know, right? They know. Well, that's incredibly important work. Francis Sumner's out there, Bev Tatum and Joseph White and Herman Kennedy. Go look up these names and see what these folks did. Really important. Gay psychology. Psychology used to diagnose homosexuality as a mental illness. It was sexual deviance, and if someone was gay, it needed to be changed and needed to be institutionalized against your will for homosexuality. That changed, and that changed our approach to sexual diversity. It changed because gay psychology did a sit-in just like black psychology, and this often happens. Whatever techniques or tactics that people of color use to try and work towards equality, other people pick up and use to work towards equality, right? So Black Lives Matter, within 1 year of that slogan emerging, everyone had their own Lives Matter t-shirt, right? Hispanic Lives Matter and Police Lives Matter and whatever. Blue Lives Matter, whatever. So it was a successful tactic. So gay psychology used the same tactic in college. And I can't find a written down recorded date for that event, but it must have been 72 or 73, because by 74 and 75, change was really cooking up, getting started. Okay, so why don't we hear about these liberation psychologies today? Where did they go? They were good, and so their practices, what they fought for, was really absorbed up into the other practices, so that it didn't seem necessary anymore to have an individual feminist psychology. Everyone kind of got feminism. There was a boom time when we were doing multicultural psychology that tried to consider everyone in their context and not just make everything pathology, diagnose it and treat it, but understand, is it relatively functional or dysfunctional? Does it make sense? That Krishnamurti line. Are we still doing that? Arguably, we have a section in the book about it. I train it really hard when I'm teaching graduate school. Diversity practice is written every class. I feel like humanism itself has kind of fallen away. 1% of psychologists are existentialists, but that's because our concerns have really been taken up in most of the rest of psychology. But modern practices, psychiatry, and this is not doing what I want. Psychiatry and psychopharm, they're out there doing the board work of just making everything about short-term treatments and corrupting the data so it all says one thing. And the job of psychiatry is to sell medication at this point. Even NAMI, the National Association for the Mentally Ill, has doubled down on the idea that if your mentation is sick, if you have a mental illness, it's really a physical illness, it's a brain disorder. And some of that work is good to sort of destigmatize people who have problems or struggles or even differences. Destigmatizing is good, but saying everything's medical is fundamentally false and fundamentally not good. It just gives all the power to the drug companies. Later, I'll show you a couple ways that is actively bad. Okay, so we kind of move towards modernity now, and we get into some of the subfields that are hot. So biological psychology, there's a couple of approaches to this. Neuropsych, is really about brains and how behavior originates in brains and neuroanatomy. And then genetic psychology. These are looking for correlates, right? So the geneticists are looking for gene behavior correlates, and the neurologists are looking for brain behavior correlates. How would that work? Let's go to prison, and we're going to find everyone convicted of a violent crime, which is a tiny proportion actually of people in prison. We have 2.6, 2.7 million people incarcerated in America right now, the highest number per capita and absolutely in the world. You know, we're well behind like Turkey and North Korea and stuff. Yay, we're number one. But you find the violent criminals and you sequence their genes, and you compare the gene sequences to just general population. What you're looking for is genes that occur more frequently in people incarcerated for violent crimes and people not incarcerated for violent crimes. And when you do that, you find, they call it the warrior gene. There is a gene more frequently occurring in violent incarcerated people. Does that mean the gene causes the violence? You know, not necessarily. Does that mean that everyone not incarcerated never committed a violent crime? Absolutely not. Does it mean they're not violent? No, it doesn't. It doesn't mean that at all. There are plenty of people with the gene not incarcerated and plenty of people incarcerated without the gene, right? It's just more frequently occurring, and so there's an influence rather than a cause, right? And then neuro, the same thing. Goodness, by now in human history, we've given people millions of math tests, right? And we can disaggregate those tests by gender most of the time. People have male names or female names, and so we can we'll throw away all the ones that are ambiguous, that could be either or, and keep the ones that are pretty clearly one gender or another, and compare the results. And when we do that, we find that men and boys are 1% better at math than girls. So much argument about this, so much. Probably the best argument is that it's outliers, right? When you look at the highest performers in math, they tend to be male. And so that skews the results, and the rest of the results are more or less 1%. But then we look at brains, and you can sex human cadavers. You can just peek under the sheet and know whether you're dealing with a male or female human, and then you can section their brain, right? What you want to do is go in the parietal lobe, where math happens, and count synapses per cubic centimeter. It's time consuming, but you can do it. And what you find is that males have on average 1% higher synaptic density in the parietal lobe, where math happens, than females. Great, brain behavior correlate. And so what you want to be able to say is that boys and men are better than girls and women at math because of their brains. But this is a good time to introduce science rule 1. But I keep coming back here. You should memorize it. Write it on the back of your hand or something. Get a face tattoo. Don't do that. Science rule 1 is never infer causation from correlation. Hit that really heavily next week. Never infer causation from correlation. How'd the brain get that way? You know, what are brains for? What do they do? You're not born with a brain that already comprehends calculus. We have to teach you that. The brain encodes experience, and male and female brains are encoding different experiences because we're having different experiences. In any classroom, K through 12, college, wherever, the teachers and professors and the students all agree on this, right? Because we can ask them, we can get their perceptions. When the teacher spends 25% of their time addressing female students, of all the time they spend addressing students, not the whole time, all the time they spend addressing students, if they spend a quarter of their time on the females, everyone agrees that they've spent the majority of their time addressing females. Who gets called on in math classes? That's right, the boys and the men get called on far more than the girls and women. Who gets encouraged to do STEM disciplines? That's right, people with penises. Who plays ball sports, where you track the trajectory of objects through space and respond to them in real time? That's math, and it lives in the parietal lobe. The brain encodes experience, and what you have here is probably much less a cause for a disparity than a biological, neurological footprint of a sexist society, right? Sexist society has left its mark differentially in our brains. And more to the point, if you want to study biology, go study biology. That's not psychology. Fundamentally, it's not the study of mental process. It's the study of biological process. Okay? And these fields of study professionally, as a rule, infer causation from correlation. Evopsych. We have problems here too. Evolution is the truest thing we can say is true, sorry. There's no good argument against evolution. We've tried tens of thousands of times by now to falsify it. We can't. It's true. Might not be true tomorrow, but it's very, very, very unlikely that'll happen. Okay? And this guy, this philosopher, Dennett, says, if I were to give an award for the single best idea anyone's ever had, I'd give it to Darwin. In a single stroke, the idea of evolution by natural selection unifies the realm of life, meaning, and purpose within the realm of space and time, cause, effect, mechanism, and physical law. This idea is really elegant and as true as anything we can say is true. Isn't it weird that in America we have to apologize for saying scientific things? Evolution's true. Sorry. That's stupid. Evopsych, though, isn't on that same footing, right? Remember that a theory is an explanatory framework that leads to falsifiable hypotheses, and evopsych often just doesn't. It's speculation. And it's speculation that's really difficult to test in practice. Okay. Case in point, differential sexual promiscuity. We used to think that men were promiscuous and women were not promiscuous. That is, men like no context sex with strangers as often as they can have it, and women don't. And we have some experiments that seem to confirm this. The famous social psych experiment, we're going to have a person stand in the university quad on the first day, and like thousands of people are going to come by, and that person's going to ask strangers, hey, would you like to have sex with me later? You know? And so it's a woman asking men or a man asking women, and of course men are far more likely to say yes. So what does that mean? Based on a bunch of observations, you know, we thought that it was true. Kinsey thought that it was true, and came up with an explanation for it, and it's called differential investment. In differential investment, what we're saying is children are much more costly for females than males in the human species. Women go through pregnancy, and because we walk upright, we have that two evolutionary stresses at once. One between giving birth to large-brained babies, and the other between walking upright. The one requires a wide pelvic opening, the other requires narrow hips, and those don't go together, right? They're push and pull, and they've resulted in imperfect solutions. And they result in a lot of infant and maternal mortality. It's risky, it's dangerous, it's expensive for women to have babies, being largely helpless for the last month of gestation. We have all the graphs between about contributions in hunter-gatherer societies, who brings in calories, and pregnant women are in the red, and for 2 or 3 years after birth, they remain in the red zone. You need men to provide those calories, and I know we live in the modern world, but we're talking evolution. Men, on the other hand, are not saddled with a squalling infant who can give them away to predators in the night, not saddled with a bunch of squishy maternal instincts and love and stuff. Men can have sex and then leave, and make millions of sperm every day, and can just sow those through society willy-nilly. And it's really low cost for males to create babies. So of course, men wouldn't be that selective. It makes sense to try and recombine your DNA with as many examples of the species as you can find, hoping to combine with lots of DNA, so you have a really good chance of being represented in follow-up generations. Females, though, would have to be really selective, because you only get a few chances to breed, and they have to be right? So you have to look for the perfect male specimen, and frankly, for a caregiver and someone who is going to stick around and supply those calories. Makes sense? From a certain detached point of view, it makes a certain amount of sense. The problem is that it's just crap. It's false. The initial observations are false. Why? When you're doing that thing where you stand in the quad and ask people if they want to have sex with you later, why would men say yes and women say no? Well, largely for sociologic reasons. And go back up to that thing Margaret Atwood said, right? It's much more dangerous and frowned upon. It's a stoning offense for women to be promiscuous. When we study actual behavior, we follow people, we experience sample, all sorts of ways of doing this. What we find is that men and women are equally sexually promiscuous. And the less rapey and murdery the context, the more equal they are. It's a bogus phenomenon. It's not a phenomenon. So we have this whole house of cards built on this foundation of initial observations that are just false. And what we want to be careful of is that our speculations don't merely confirm our biases, right? This is scientific sexism and scientific racism. It's just speculation that's meant to reinforce and support the things we already believe that are problematic. So along the way, we're probably going to stop in and talk about EvoPsych a couple times along the way. But just like your margarita, put some salt on the rim, okay? Take your tequila with salt. Take your EvoPsych. Dead Psych's out there. I teach a whole class on it. It's fun. Psych 235. Developmental psychology is about the normal sort of milestones and average pathways through life. By age 1, children should be walking, and by 2, they should have 300 words in their vocabulary, whatever. And the normal stuff, the normative informs the abnormal. So a kid is 2 and they're not walking yet. There might be a problem. We want to investigate that. Difference isn't necessarily deficit. There's a lot of variation, and people catch up or slow down, or sometimes don't, but they're fine, But those are warning signs, and you can go and do your investigation and find out what's the case. We're interested really in what are the factors that lead to the outcomes we might want. Like, do you want to be happy at age 65? Well, in that case, you want to look at the Harvard longitudinal study that studied people from before they were born to the age of 65, and then try to correlate their experiences with their levels of happiness later, among like 1,000 other things. That's one of the things they did, right? So you want to be happy. That psych has some answers for that. Education and productivity and wellness and so on. What are the factors, especially early in life, that lead to those outcomes later? Poverty. And this is all kicked off by Jean Piaget, contracted by the Swiss school system to find out how do children grow and develop and what are their cognitive capacities. So you can start to aim education at age groups appropriately. Personality psychology is out there, and they just want to know, what are people like? Can we classify personality types and then make meaningful predictions? Spoiler alert, not really, but people are really into it, you know. Like astrology is amateur personality psychology with no factual basis. The assertion here is really that the primary responsibility for outcomes lies with the individual. It's because you were an extrovert that you acted this way in that context, like that kind of thing. Social psychology, though, is really looking at the influences of situations on individual behavior. And it largely successfully refutes personality psychology. The proximal cause of any behavior seems to be circumstantial. We have so much evidence for this, it's really sickening. It'll shake your foundations. So if you love that stuff, at least take Psych 2, and we'll talk about it. We'll spend a week on it. But you can also take the whole course on social psychology, which is a barn burner. It has some really important ideas. These are probably the 3 most important things in social psychology. One is cognitive dissonance. This is the idea that it's hard to get people to change their minds on a thing. The harder you work to believe something's true, the more you believe it's true, right? Because you're not one unified mind. You're functionally at least 2 minds. Your forebrain, which is making logical decisions and slowing down and considering things reasonably, and your hindbrain, the ancient cortices, the limbic system, that's making like survival decisions based on hunger and sex and fear. And balancing those needs is really, you know, Freud was trying to get at that with the ego and super ego, with no bio basis. The bio basis is strong there. So you make most of your decisions with that low brain, like meanly, based on fear and stuff. And then when those snap decisions don't match up with your values, the way your frontal lobe construes them, rather than change the behavior or go back and fix it, more often than not, you rationalize that behavior in the frontal lobe. So whatever you believe, you know, the more that I present evidence against it, the more you rationalize believing the thing and the stronger you believe it. That's a nonsense universe to live in, isn't it? The next important idea, oh, we can manipulate you so hard with this. And people are manipulating you really hard with this. Global warming, the oil companies, when we started getting public knowledge of global warming, I'm going to keep saying that climate change is a Republican word to make it not seem important. Global warming is happening. And when we started to know it was happening, the oil companies and the coal companies, oil in particular, used affiliations to get their message out, right? They aligned with libertarian causes. They made it about freedom and regulation, and they bought out the libertarian think tanks, showing up at libertarian conferences, right? So if you're a libertarian, which is fine, it's a valid philosophical, moral, and political position, but if you're a libertarian and the oil companies are disguised as libertarians and making the points from your point of view, you buy in. And when they start to say that climate change is a communist hoax to defund the government that funds NASA, you buy it for weird reasons, right? You haven't started at the beginning and reviewed all of the scientific literature and reached a decision. You've chosen a team, a side, and then whatever your side says must be right. You'll do all this mental gymnastics to rationalize, justify believing something totally, utterly, and in all other ways false is true. The harder you have to work to do it, right, the stronger that belief. And so at its height, this movement had convinced like 40% of Americans that climate change was a hoax. Now it's down to like 25%. Because you can see it with your own eyes, right? You live in Colorado and you were here for that 2016 hailstorm where it damaged so much auto glass. There wasn't auto glass left in the state to repair the cars, right? The just world hypothesis. People get what they deserve. Obviously not, right? Obviously not. But this gets used to manipulate you to, in America, the war on poverty is really a war on the poor. If people are poor, it's because they're stupid and they didn't get their education, and not because of circumstantial factors or because the billionaires are hoarding money, you know. Is ultimately racist, and this is the racism at the heart of one particular political party. It's the just world hypothesis. It's not a specific antipathy towards people of color. It's the idea that in America, if you work hard, you can succeed. And so if people aren't succeeding, it's because they're not working hard. And then when you go through the data and you find that Black people in particular, but people of color generally, and the darker your skin, the truer it is, are more likely to be poor, to be unemployed, to be incarcerated, particularly for crimes of poverty, then you start to go, well, then it must be because those people deserve that, right? And you get the Bill Cosby racist. Well, just turn your head around frontwards and pull your pants up and start applying for jobs, and then you'll be fine. But you won't, because there are big systemic issues at play, systemic racism at play. If you believe people get what they deserve, you're a racist and a sexist. And the fundamental attribution error, which is our tendency to blame people's bad outcomes on their individual traits. It's about them. When if it was us, we would let ourselves off the hook for circumstances. So maybe you find out that your roommate got an F on their math test, and you blame them for being stupid or not studying or drinking all the time, or right. But then you find out you got an F on the same math test, and you go, yeah, but the test was really hard. You know, it had stuff that wasn't in the material, and we didn't. You know, we had a snow day that day, and yada yada yada. It's the fundamental attribution. Other people's failings are about them as individuals. Your failings, though, are about circumstance. And those three things together, right, you can see how they're used every day to motivate political ideologies and voting behaviors and other problems. Okay. Very important. Most of our behavior is not about what we think and believe, though. Most of our behavior is about the circumstance in which we find ourselves. IO psychology, this used to be really important. I wouldn't even say this is a thing in modernity. A couple of branches here, sort of interactions, person-machine interactions. How do people actually use technology in their environment? Like person-system interactions. So how do we actually interact with admissions and counseling, and the disability office, and how do we actually talk to each other? And this is about process improvements, smoothing the way, and a whole branch about effective hiring and training. How do you get the best personnel? And then how do you keep them? And then how do you train them and refine them over time? In America, the pendulum here has swung really, really far to the right towards capital, right? We have these stupid nonsense arguments about capitalism and socialism as though they're opposites, and socialism's a scare word, and that's just trash. It's trash. Capitalism and communism and socialism rather are a continuum. And in the business world, it's about how much do you value investors versus how much do you value labor. We've always had these arguments. Rich people have always gotten you to try and side with them, and workers have sometimes tried to get you to side with them. And we kind of can compute the optimal balance, how much money a company makes, how much of that is awarded to the labor side, and how much is awarded to the investment side. And that number is right up between 60, 55, 65% of the rewards go to capital, and we have an optimally functioning economy and society. Okay. Right now, it's way up there in the 70s and 80s and 90s. Kind of pendulum's way over here. Okay. Because of that, a lot of the stuff that IO psychology focuses on, it just doesn't matter anymore. It's all about maximizing profits and efficiencies. So this stuff just, the IO psychologist winds up answering questions like, how hard can we squeeze labor, right? How can we do it? How can we get people to settle for job titles, promotions that aren't promotions, more responsibility and less compensation? Questions about employee satisfaction and well-being, do those even matter in 2020? And people in the audience with jobs, I'm sure most of you are going, I mean, obviously not. Obviously not. How do we make people feel valued without actually valuing them? This lecture is being recorded in the time of coronavirus. I will probably use it forever. So one thing that's happening now is like Kroger, who owns, is it Safeway? They're the Safeway people, and the Ralph's people, and grocery store workers are essential employees, and they're being worked hard in initially quite unsanitary conditions, right? Very risky to be at work all day with people breathing into your workspace in coronavirus. And so they've campaigned, the unions in particular have campaigned to get some like hazard pay and additional compensation and more employees and safer work settings. And Kroger's responded by producing a commercial saying thank you to their employees. Hi, we appreciate you. And the union's like, we don't need to be appreciated in a TV commercial. We need to be appreciated in our bank accounts. No, it's cheaper to make a commercial. That's a problem. Good health psychology exists, and that's about what behaviors lead to the best health outcomes, like obviously don't smoke, put your babies on their back to sleep, a certain amount of exercise and diet. Like, how can we promote those behaviors when we've identified them? We have clinical and counseling psychology, the stuff you'd think of as psychology, which is largely the diagnosis and treatment of mental illness. Counseling and psychotherapy don't have to be that. In my field, it's not. That's largely what it's about right now. And then the last one, hopefully, because I really have to pee, is forensic psychology. And when you hear forensic psychology, you think of like criminal profilers. Criminal profilers are almost always not psychologists. They're FBI agents or sometimes police officers with special training, additional training above and beyond their law enforcement credentials. What else you need to know is that no criminal profiler ever apprehended a suspect, right? Regular agents did that through good police work, getting the clues and the evidence and following the money, you know, means, motive, and opportunity. Those get you the person and you break their alibi and you go to trial. A criminal profile, they just spend all their time refining criminal profiles. Okay, the forensic psychologist is really the person doing a bunch of post hoc evaluation. So we have someone standing accused of a crime and maybe they seem incompetent to stand trial. We need to rule whether they can assist their own defense. We have to try and find that out and then make an argument to the judge, and the judge is going to decide this person is non-compos mentis. Insanity pleas was the person able to differentiate right from wrong at the time of the crime. Doing that post hoc is extremely challenging. Like 1% of the accused attempt it, and a similar percentage, like maybe 10%, actually succeed in those kinds of defenses. And even if you succeed, you go to a mental hospital, a psychiatric hospital, often forever, so it's not really getting away with anything. It's getting treatment rather than incarceration, but the place that you're getting the treatment is often as bad as the place you'd be incarcerated. So that's mens rea, lacking the guilty mind. And then we might do return to competence work. We found you're incompetent to stand trial. You can't assist in your own defense, but with medication and treatment, can we get to a point where you can do that? And then some risk evaluation. People have been put into the psychiatric system because of crimes that they've admitted to, and when are they safe to release from the institution back into society and so forth. That's forensic psychology. Okay, so we did it. We did chapter 1, and I'll see you again next week for chapter 2. Good luck.